My husband refuses to cut off contact with his ex, even though she's trying to break us up. And now he's demanding I let her move into our home to prove I trust him. When my husband, Nick, 34M, first told me his ex, Rachel, 33F, had reached out, I didn't think much of it. He mentioned it casually over dinner one night, saying she'd just wanted to catch up. At the time, I brushed it off as one of those awkward but harmless reconnections. Nick had always been open with me about their past, and I'd had no reason to doubt his commitment. But then their conversations became more frequent. First, it was texts during the day. Then the occasional phone call that he'd take outside or in another room. I could feel the balance of our relationship start to tilt, but every time I brought it up, he brushed it off with a calm reassurance. "It's nothing, Kara," he'd say with a soft smile. "Rachel's just going through a rough time, and I'm the only one she can talk to. You don't have to worry about this." And for a while, I tried not to. But the tension kept growing, a steady pull up my heart every time I'd glance over and see his phone lighting up with a message from her. The texts and calls went from occasional to frequent, then constant. And then Rachel herself started texting me, subtle, strange messages that always left me uneasy. She'd send notes like, "Isn't it nice that Nick and I can still be close friends?" Or, "I'm so glad he's always been there for me." At first, I ignored them, assuming she was just trying to ease any potential discomfort. But it wasn't long before the tone of her messages started to shift. "Nick deserves someone who understands him completely," she texted one day, followed by, "He and I go way back. We have something you'll never have." The words settled over me like a dark cloud, and when I confronted Nick, hoping he'd understand how inappropriate it felt, he only got defensive. "Kara, you're overreacting," he said, shaking his head. "Rachel's just lonely. She's not trying to hurt us. You don't have to worry." But I was worried. The more I saw Rachel's name flashing on his screen, the more that worry turned to doubt. It wasn't just Rachel's persistence that bothered me. It was Nick's calm, almost dismissive attitude toward it. He didn't seem to realize, or want to realize, how deeply her presence was affecting our relationship. And the more I questioned it, the more he seemed to withdraw, spending more time on his phone, more time away from home on nights when she needed someone to talk to. Then came the night when everything changed. Nick and I had just had a small argument about Rachel, something I thought would be a minor conversation, a chance to set some boundaries, but instead it escalated. I'd simply asked if he could limit the time he spent talking to her. "You know, maybe it's not the best idea for her to be so close right now," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. He looked at me, eyes narrowing. "So you're saying you don't trust me?" I sighed, frustrated. "It's not that I don't trust you, Nick, but she's obviously trying to come between us, and it feels like you're letting it happen." Instead of the understanding I'd hoped for, he crossed his arms and took a deep breath, as if preparing himself to lay down some kind of ultimatum. "Kara," he said firmly, "if you really trusted me, this wouldn't be an issue. Rachel's been a part of my life for a long time, and she's not going away just because you're feeling insecure." "Insecure?" I echoed, stunned. "She's actively trying to undermine our marriage. You're not just staying friends with her, Nick, you're giving her a space in our lives that's affecting us." He shook his head, his face unreadable. "Then maybe it's time to really prove that you trust me," he said slowly. "Maybe Rachel should come stay with us for a little while." I stared at him, thinking I must have misheard. "Stay with us? You're saying you want her to move in?" He nodded, as if he were proposing something completely reasonable. "It would only be temporary. She's going through a hard time with her living situation. And this way, you can see firsthand that there's nothing between us. It's the perfect way to put all of this to rest." I was speechless. The idea of his ex moving into our home, into our shared space, felt like a line he should never have even thought to cross. "Nick, you're seriously suggesting that your ex, who's been trying to sabotage our marriage, should live with us?" "You're not being fair, Kara," he replied, his voice cool. "This isn't about her. It's about whether you trust me. If you can't handle Rachel staying with us, then maybe the problem isn't her at all." I could barely believe what I was hearing. Somehow, in his mind, my discomfort with Rachel had morphed into a lack of trust, a failing on my part. I'd gone into the conversation hoping he'd see things from my perspective, but instead he was twisting it, making it seem as though I was the one being unreasonable. "Nick, she's literally trying to undermine us," I said, my voice breaking. "She's sending me messages about how she and you are meant to be, about how I'll never understand you the way she does. And you think I'm overreacting?" He sighed, looking exasperated. "She's hurting Kara. Sometimes people say things they don't mean when they're going through a rough time. She needs support, not judgment." I shook my head, feeling a combination of anger and heartbreak rising in my chest. "So let me get this straight. You'd rather risk our marriage than set a boundary with Rachel?" "This isn't about boundaries," he shot back, his tone sharp. "This is about you trying to control who I can and can't be friends with. I thought you trusted me, Kara. But clearly you're letting your own insecurities dictate everything." He kept throwing that word, insecure, at me, as if my concerns were some flaw I needed to work on, as if my discomfort with his ex moving in was just a petty jealousy I needed to get over. But this wasn't about jealousy. It was about feeling betrayed by the very person I'd trusted most in the world. I looked at him, feeling a strange numbness settle over me. "So you're really going to put this on me?" I asked, my voice hollow. "You're saying that if I don't let her move in, it's proof that I don't trust you?" He nodded, crossing his arms as if his decision was final. "Yes, because if you trusted me, you wouldn't see Rachel as a threat. She's my friend, and she needs help right now. If you can't accept that, maybe you need to look at why you're feeling so threatened." The words cut deeper than I could have imagined. This wasn't the Nick I thought I'd married, the man who had always been so open, so committed to our partnership. I realized then that he was willing to let this woman into our home, into our lives, because he'd rather indulge her than protect what we had. And he was willing to put the blame on me if I didn't go along with it. "Nick, I don't know what's happened to you, but this isn't about trust anymore," I said, my voice shaking. "This is about you letting someone else come between us and making it my problem to fix." He scoffed, dismissing my words with a wave of his hand. "I don't know what else to tell you, Kara. If you can't handle Rachel staying with us, maybe you need to take a long look at yourself." I couldn't say another word. I turned and left the room, feeling the weight of his words settle over me, crushing the trust we'd spent years building. He was right about one thing. This was about trust, but it was no longer about whether I trusted him. It was about whether he valued our marriage enough to protect it. And right now, it felt like he'd already made his choice. After that fight with Nick, I barely slept. His words kept echoing in my head. His accusation that my discomfort with Rachel was somehow proof of my own insecurity. I could barely comprehend it. My husband was defending his ex, twisting things to make it look like I was the problem. I'd trusted him with everything, and now he was testing that trust in the most extreme way, like he didn't care if it shattered. The next day, I tried to go about my routine as normally as possible, hoping he'd have had some time to reflect and see reason. But when I walked into the kitchen that morning, Nick was already there, packing a small overnight bag by the counter. "Where are you going?" I asked, immediately feeling the tension return. "I'm staying at Rachel's tonight," he replied, not looking up from his bag. "I need some space to clear my head, and Rachel understands what I'm going through. She knows me." I stood there, stunned, my mind racing. Not only was he ignoring the hurt he'd caused, he was going to stay at her place as if that was the most normal thing in the world. "You're going to have the comfort, knowing how much this is hurting me?" I asked, my voice trembling. He looked up, finally meeting my gaze, and shrugged. "I thought it would be easier for both of us if I wasn't here tonight. Clearly, we're not seeing eye to eye on this, and I think being around her will remind me of the stability I used to have." Stability. That word hit me like a punch to the gut. Our marriage was falling apart, and he was turning to her, framing it as if our problems were because of me, as if Rachel was somehow the stable choice. "Nick, don't you see how this looks?" I asked, the hurt slipping into my voice. "You're choosing her over me, over us. You're letting her pull you away from everything we've built." He shook his head, sighing. "I'm not choosing her over you, Kara. I'm choosing to not let your jealousy ruin my relationships. This isn't about her. It's about trust, something you're clearly lacking right now." And with that, he turned and left. I heard the front door click shut, and as the silence settled over the house, I felt a cold dread creep in. This wasn't just a simple argument. He was making a deliberate choice to let Rachel come between us, to let her be the one he confided in. And the fact that he couldn't or wouldn't see how destructive that was made me question everything. Over the next few days, Nick's absence only emphasized how much our marriage had changed. I found myself bracing for every call, every message, wondering if it would be him saying he'd finally seen the light, or worse, him asking me to accept Rachel moving in. But his silence was deafening. He didn't call, didn't message, and it left me feeling like I was in limbo, as if he was testing how long he could stay away before I gave in. Finally, after 3 days, he returned. I heard his car pull up late in the evening, and a few minutes later, he walked into the living room where I'd been sitting waiting. "Are you ready to talk?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged, as if the last few days had meant nothing. "There's not much to say, Kara. Rachel's situation isn't getting better. She's barely getting by at her place, and I don't see why we shouldn't help her." I felt a surge of frustration, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Nick, I'm not saying she can't have help. I'm saying she can't have you. She can't be the person you turn to when we're going through something." "That's not right." He crossed his arms, looking unimpressed. "So what's your solution? You want me to just abandon her because you're uncomfortable? That's not fair, Kara. You're acting as though she's trying to break us up when she's done nothing but be there for me." "Be there for you?" I said, incredulous. "You left our home to stay with her. You've ignored every boundary we agreed on in our marriage because of her, and somehow that's my fault." He gave a frustrated sigh, running a hand through his hair. "I'm trying to help someone in need, and instead of supporting me, you're making it about you." "You're married to me, Nick," I shot back, feeling the anger bubble to the surface. "You're supposed to put us first. You don't just leave to stay with your ex because you're unhappy with me. Do you even care what this is doing to our marriage?" Nick looked at me, his expression a mix of frustration and something else. He was silent for a long moment, then finally said, "You know what, Kara? Maybe I don't want a marriage where I'm controlled by jealousy and suspicion. Maybe I want a marriage built on trust." The words hit me like a slap, and I felt a chill run down my spine. "Is that how you see it? You think I'm trying to control you?" "Yes," he replied without hesitation. "If you trusted me, this wouldn't be an issue. But clearly you don't." I stared at him, feeling a hollowness settle in my chest. I realized with heartbreaking clarity that he wasn't seeing things from my perspective at all. He had no intention of understanding my hurt, no interest in saving what we had. In his mind, this was my issue, my insecurity, and he was justified in continuing down this path. "Fine," I said finally, my voice steady but cold. "If that's how you feel, then maybe you're right. Maybe this marriage isn't what you want." For the first time, I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his expression, but he quickly masked it, shrugging. "I don't want to keep having this argument, Kara. It's exhausting, and I can't keep defending myself to you." The words cut deep, but I felt a strange sense of clarity. "Then don't, because I'm done trying to convince you of something that should be obvious." He didn't respond, just turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the silence once again. As I sat there, I felt a cold realization settle over me. Nick had made his choice, and it was clear that no amount of reasoning, no amount of compromise would change it. Over the next few days, he barely spoke to me, spending more time away from home, presumably with Rachel. His absence became routine, and the few times we did see each other, the tension between us was thick, each conversation tense and charged. Then late one night, he came home, clearly having had a few drinks. I was already in bed, trying to fall asleep, when I heard him stumble into the bedroom, sighing loudly as he dropped his keys on the dresser. "Rachel said you were the problem," he mumbled, his words slurring. "She says you're too controlling. Maybe she's right." I sat up, the shock of his words slicing through the darkness. "Excuse me." He swayed slightly, his eyes glassy. "She says you don't trust me, that you're too possessive. she'd understand if I wanted to leave. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. He was letting her plant these ideas, letting her come between us in ways I'd never thought possible. And as I looked at him, disheveled and lost, I realized how much he'd changed, and how deeply Rachel's influence had twisted everything between us. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going or what my next step would be, but I couldn't stay in that house any longer. Nick's choice was clear, and I couldn't keep sacrificing my dignity, my sanity, to someone who no longer valued our marriage. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of freedom mixed with grief, knowing that I'd left behind everything I'd tried to build with him. Leaving Nick felt both like breaking free and like tearing away a part of myself. I ended up at my friend Lily's 32F house, a close friend who knew everything that had been happening. She didn't say much when I showed up on her doorstep, bag in hand, clearly a mess. She just hugged me tightly, her silent support grounding me when I felt like my whole world was unraveling. The first night, I barely spoke. We sat together on her couch, her presence comforting as I tried to process everything. I kept thinking of Nick's words, his drunken confession that Rachel thought I was too controlling, that maybe he should just leave me. The man who once told me he'd spend his life with me had somehow come to see me as a barrier, as if I was the obstacle standing in the way of some kind of twisted happiness. A few days passed, and I tried to settle into a new routine. I couldn't bear to look at my phone, knowing that Nick hadn't reached out, hadn't even checked to see if I was okay. I avoided social media, dreading that I'd see something of him and Rachel together. And while I tried to focus on moving forward, I felt the nagging urge to check in on what was happening at home. Finally, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I reached out to one of our mutual friends, Mark, 35M, who'd known Nick for years. "Hey Mark," I texted, feeling strange about reaching out after so long without talking. "Sorry to message out of the blue. Have you talked to Nick lately?" It didn't take long for him to reply. "Hey, Kara, yeah, we grabbed a beer a few days ago. He mentioned you guys were having some issues. What's going on?" I hesitated, not sure how much to say, but I figured it was best to be honest. Rachel's been coming between us for a while now. He keeps defending her, saying I don't trust him, and he actually suggested she move in with us to prove my trust. I ended up leaving because he wouldn't stop siding with her. Mark's response was quick and direct. "Are you serious?" He made it sound like you were just overreacting to him having an ex as a friend. He never mentioned she'd move in. My heart sank. Nick had been downplaying everything, making it look like I was the irrational one. He left out a lot, Mark. She's been trying to break us up, and he's defending her every step of the way. I don't know what to do." Mark was quiet for a minute, then replied, "Kara, I hate to say this, but Rachel's always been trouble. Even back when they dated, she played mind games. I didn't know it was this serious, or I would have said something sooner." I thanked him, feeling both validated and heartbroken. If even Mark, one of Nick's closest friends, saw the red flags, then maybe I wasn't imagining it. Maybe I wasn't just being insecure or controlling like Nick kept insisting. But what hurt the most was realizing that Nick had made his choice and he hadn't chosen us. The next few days were a blur of emotions. I started to consider what a life without Nick might actually look like. I thought about the memories, the plans, and all the things we'd built together. It was hard to even picture a future that didn't include him, and yet I knew that going back would mean sacrificing every boundary I had set, every ounce of self-respect. Then, out of the blue, I received a message from Rachel. Just seeing her name pop up on my screen made my blood run cold. Her message was short, but it was enough to reopen every wound. "Just so you know, Nick is staying with me now. He needed someone who actually understands him. Maybe if you trusted him, things wouldn't have turned out like this." It took everything in me not to scream. Not only had she succeeded in getting him to stay with her, but she was rubbing it in my face as if this was some kind of game she'd won. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. Rachel had wanted Nick back all along, and he'd been too blind, or maybe just too willing, to see it. Lily found me staring at my phone, my hands trembling with rage. I showed her the message, barely able to find the words. She's got him now, I whispered, the weight of it finally settling over me. She got what she wanted, and he let her. Lily didn't hesitate. Kara, you don't have to take this. Don't let her get the last word, and don't let Nick think he can just walk all over you. You fought for this relationship, and he threw it away. That's on him, not you. Her words hit home, and I felt a surge of clarity. I wasn't going to sit here and let them rewrite the narrative, let them make me the villain of my own story. For the first time since I left, I felt a sense of purpose, a need to reclaim control over my life. The next day, I reached out to a lawyer to discuss the logistics of separation. I knew it would be a long, painful process, but I was ready. I'd spent too long questioning myself, bending over backward to save a marriage that Nick had already given up on. It was time to let go. A few days later, as I was preparing to leave Lily's house for a short walk, Nick called. Seeing his name on my screen brought a pang of bitterness, but I answered, steeling myself for whatever excuses he was about to make. "Hey, Kara," he said, his tone subdued. I wanted to check in. I didn't expect you to just leave like that. We need to talk." I took a deep breath, keeping my voice steady. "Nick, there's nothing left to talk about. You made your choice, and I'm done being the one who has to compromise." There was a pause, and then he sighed. "I don't get why you're making this so difficult. I was only trying to help Rachel out. If you really loved me, you'd understand." "If you really loved me, you wouldn't have made me choose between you and your ex," I replied, my voice shaking. "You wouldn't have invited her into our marriage, knowing how it would hurt me." "Look, Rachel and I have a history," he said, his tone defensive. "She was there for me when I was at my lowest, and I wasn't just going to abandon her because you're insecure." Hearing him say that word, insecure, for what felt like the 1,000th time only solidified my resolve. "Insecure," I repeated, letting out a bitter laugh. "You're calling me insecure because I refuse to let someone manipulate our marriage." "Kara, you're blowing this way out of proportion," he replied, his voice laced with frustration. "I don't want to argue. Just come home and we'll figure it out." But I'd already made up my mind. "No, Nick, I'm done trying to figure it out. You've made it clear who you're choosing, and I deserve better than this." Before he could reply, I hung up, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I wasn't going back to someone who chose his ex's comfort over my trust, who would rather lose his wife than set a boundary with another woman. I was done letting him twist my love into weakness, my boundaries into insecurity. Over the next few weeks, I filed the paperwork, gathered my things from the house, and began to build a life that was mine and mine alone. It was painful, but with Lily's support, I started to feel like myself again. I didn't have to fight for Nick's approval or chase after a relationship that was only making me feel less. Rachel sent a few more messages, gloating here and there, but I ignored them. She and Nick could have each other. They'd already proven they deserved one another. And while I would always mourn the marriage I thought I'd had, I knew I'd come out of this stronger, knowing that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. Months later, as I looked around my new apartment, filled with everything I'd chosen myself, I felt a strange sense of peace. I was free of the toxicity, free of the endless battles for respect and trust, and for the first time in a long time, I knew I'd made the right choice for myself, for my dignity, and for my future. Months passed, and each day brought new clarity. I was rediscovering who I was without the weight of Nick's accusations and Rachel's manipulation hanging over me. Lily remained my rock through it all, reminding me that it was okay to take things slow, that I didn't have to have everything figured out right away. And for the first time in what felt like years, I was breathing freely, no longer constantly second-guessing myself or wondering if I was somehow not enough. But just as I was settling into this new phase of life, Nick reached out again. His message was strangely formal, lacking the usual defensiveness. "Kara, I'd like to meet and talk if you're willing. There are things I need to explain. Let me know if you're open to it." I stared at my phone, debating whether to respond. Part of me wanted to ignore him and let him live with the choices he'd made, but curiosity, and maybe a need for closure, got the best of me. The next day, I met him at a quiet cafe. He looked different, somehow smaller, almost worn down. As he sat across from me, I could tell he'd rehearsed what he wanted to say, his fingers fidgeting with the cup in front of him. "Kara, I realize I made a huge mistake," he started, his voice low. "I let Rachel manipulate things. I didn't see it at the time, but I was wrong. I was trying to help someone I cared about, but I let it go too far. And now I'm seeing what it cost me." I watched him, my face impassive. "So, what is it that you want from me, Nick? Because you made your choice more than once." He winced, nodding slowly. "I know I did, but I need you to know that I wasn't. I wasn't trying to replace you. Rachel made me feel like I owed her something, like I'd abandoned her back then, and I guess I wanted to make up for that. But in doing that, I abandoned you." Hearing him admit it felt surreal, like I was finally seeing the truth emerge from under all the lies. But his regret didn't change the past, didn't erase the pain I'd felt, or the way he'd tried to make me feel inadequate for months. "Nick, you chose her over and over, even when you knew it was hurting me. You ignored my needs, my boundaries, and you blamed me for it." He took a deep breath, his hands tightening around the coffee cup. "I know, and I hate myself for it. But I've realized now that Rachel was using me, manipulating my guilt. I don't want to be with her. I was wrong about everything." I looked at him, feeling a mix of anger and pity. He was admitting everything I'd suspected all along, but it felt too late. "So what do you expect me to do with this, Nick? Because I've moved on. I've rebuilt my life." He nodded, looking defeated. "I don't expect anything. I needed you to know that it wasn't about you. It was about my own mistakes, my own inability to set boundaries. I thought maybe, if you knew that, it would mean something." I took a deep breath, feeling a weight lift slightly. This was the apology I'd once desperately wanted, the acknowledgement I'd hoped for when we were still together. But now, sitting here, hearing him admit his faults, I realized I didn't need it. I'd already moved beyond this, already accepted that he wasn't the man I thought he was. "Thank you for saying that, Nick," I replied, my tone calm. "But the damage is done. I won't ever be able to look at you the same way. I won't ever be able to trust you again, knowing how easily you turned against me. I wish you well, but I need to keep moving forward, without you." He looked crushed, but he nodded, finally accepting my decision. "I understand. I'll leave you alone, Kara. You deserve better." After that, I left the cafe feeling strangely at peace. I'd faced him, heard his apology, but it didn't change anything. It didn't undo the betrayal or the way he treated me. I had already made my peace with it, and this was simply the final chapter closing. A few weeks later, Rachel, of all people, reached out to me. Her message was short, almost apologetic. "I heard Nick talk to you. I'm sorry for how things ended between you two. I never meant to hurt you." I felt a wave of anger rise, but I tamped it down. Rachel was no longer part of my life, no longer a threat. I didn't reply, leaving her words unanswered. I knew now that she thrived on control, on twisting things to suit her. I wasn't going to let her pull me into that cycle again. Instead, I poured my energy into building the life I wanted. I took up a new hobby, joined a local community group, and threw myself into projects I'd once set aside. With every day, I felt a little lighter, a little stronger, no longer carrying the weight of Nick's betrayal. Lily and I celebrated milestones, each little step forward, and with every accomplishment, I felt more like the person I was meant to be. One evening, months after our final conversation, I received a small envelope in the mail. It was from Nick, a final letter in which he apologized once more, this time for everything: the manipulation, the defensiveness, the countless times he let me down. He admitted that he had a lot to work on, and that he hoped one day he'd become someone who didn't hurt the people he loved. I read it, feeling nothing but a quiet acceptance. Nick was on his own path now, and I was on mine. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it away, knowing it would serve as a reminder of how far I'd come. This chapter, painful as it had been, had shaped me, had shown me what I deserved and what I could never settle for again. As I looked around my cozy apartment, filled with pieces I'd chosen myself, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. I'd faced betrayal, fought to reclaim my sense of worth, and in the end, I found a strength in myself I hadn't known existed. I was ready to keep moving forward, leaving behind everything and everyone that no longer had a place in my life. Months passed, and I felt myself fully stepping into my new life, one I'd built on my own terms. The weight of my old life with Nick, and all the ways he let me down, faded more with each passing day. I was rediscovering who I was, independent and whole, finding joy in things I hadn't made time for in years. One Saturday morning, I was at a farmer's market with Lily when I spotted someone familiar across the stalls. Mark, 35M, one of Nick's close friends who'd been supportive during my split. He caught my eye and waved, making his way over with a friendly smile. "Kara, it's been a while," he said, clearly happy to see me. "How are you doing?" I smiled, genuinely glad to see a familiar face. "Better than ever, actually. I've been rebuilding, I guess you could say." He nodded, looking pleased. "I'm glad to hear it. I always thought you got a raw deal. And honestly, you look like you're doing great." I thanked him, grateful for the validation. Mark had always known the more subtle dynamics of my marriage with Nick, and his understanding had been a comfort during the early days of my separation. We chatted for a while, catching up, and then Mark glanced down, almost as if debating whether to say something. "Look, Kara, I don't want to dredge up old stuff," but he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Nick's been, well, he's a different guy now. I think the fallout with you hit him harder than he ever admitted. He seems lost, like he's still trying to figure out who he is." I took in Mark's words, feeling a strange mix of relief and sadness. There was a time when I'd thought Nick would have been everything I needed, but that time was long gone. Whatever he was dealing with now was his to face alone. "Well, I hope he finds what he's looking for," I replied, my tone sincere. "But that part of my life is over. I've moved on." Mark smiled, nodding approvingly. "Good for you, Kara. You deserve a fresh start." And that was the final confirmation I hadn't known I'd needed. Whatever struggles Nick was facing, they were his to deal with now. My life was my own again, and I didn't need to look back. Over the following weeks, I threw myself even deeper into the things I loved. I took a cooking class, redecorated my apartment with pieces that reflected my taste, and began spending more time outdoors, going on hikes and exploring trails with Lily. Life was peaceful and, for the first time in years, truly fulfilling. One evening, as I was organizing my bookshelf, I came across the old envelope Nick had sent, the last letter he'd written, filled with apologies and admissions. I'd saved it back then as a reminder of how far I'd come, but looking at it now, I realized it had served its purpose. I didn't need reminders of that chapter anymore. I didn't need a tether to my past to appreciate my present. Without a second thought, I tore the letter in half, then into quarters, and tossed it into the trash. I felt lighter instantly, as if I'd finally released the last threads of the old life I'd fought so hard to leave behind. A few days later, I treated myself to a small celebration, marking the anniversary of my new beginning, the day I'd walked away from a toxic marriage and reclaimed my independence. Lily and a few other close friends joined me at a cozy little bistro, and as we laughed, shared stories, and toasted to each other's journeys, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for everything I'd gained. In that moment, surrounded by people who truly cared, I realized that I was no longer just surviving, I was thriving. The love I'd been seeking had been there all along, within myself and in the friendships I'd built. The happiness, the security, and the peace I'd wanted so desperately were no longer out of reach. They were right here, and they were mine. As the evening wound down, Lily raised her glass to me, her eyes shining. "To Kara," she said, her voice full of pride, "for showing us all what it means to rise above and live life on your own terms." Everyone around the table raised their glasses, and I smiled, lifting mine to meet theirs. I didn't just feel grateful, I felt free. Finally, I was exactly where I was meant to be, with the people I was meant to share my life with, and a future full of possibility ahead of me. I had let go of the past, and for the first time, I was ready, truly ready, to embrace whatever came next.